Welcome to the Low Tox Life podcast.
So these chronically stressed grasshoppers that were moving further, worried about the web building spiders, getting a bit nervous, eating sugar, getting into this cycle of depression, anxiety, and obesity. Already your listeners are going, that sounds familiar.
Sounds a bit like
It's,
someone I
and
know.
it
Yeah.
is, it's familiar because it is exactly what we've done to our own society.
I'm Alex Stewart, your host, and I'm pretty sure that obesity study on grasshoppers, as we unpack it a lot more thoroughly on the show, is going to blow your mind the way it did mine. Simon Mustoe is an ecologist of over 30 years, and I'm so thrilled to have him on the show to bring you genuine hope and a sense that there is so much you can do that doesn't involve big grand gestures and constantly posting about all the doom around the planet and the state of conservation right now. You will feel more hopeful after this hour with Simon, I guarantee it. We unpack a few incredible examples from projects that he is actively working on, has worked on in the past, and of course also from his latest book, which is How to Survive the Next 100 Years, Lessons from Nature. I do hope you feel a genuine sense of hope at the end of this hour. Now, one of the things that is dramatically impacting our health and ecology, we know the science around the impact to bird life, to insects, with blue light and artificial light in our cities and regional areas. Block Blue Light can help here. They have a huge range of light bulbs, masks, sleeping lights, portable lights, glasses, track lights. So many options to help you block blue light. Your code is LowToxLife and your discount is 15% off. It's all the month of July to help you start blocking blue light and noticing the difference that it makes in your home. Good. Simon, hello, how are you?
I'm very well, Alex. How are you?
I'm really well. I'm thrilled to be speaking with you about not just, I don't want to say your book and how to survive the next 100 years, because that just sounds like we're here to talk about a book, but a book happens because of a huge amount of inquiry, curiosity, realization, and deduction. And that you have in spades, as well as still more questions to come. And I think you found a really unique way to talk about conservation, environmentalism, some of the things we think we're doing because that's what good people do in these cases, where actually we could sometimes be focusing on the wrong things. So we could start so many places. I have a bazillion questions, but ecology first. Why, Simon? Why do you care? How did it show up for you in your life?
Okay, so ecology is one of those subjects which over the course of my lifetime I've begun to realize is incredibly hard to understand. I probably worked it out actually at uni. We did a couple of years of ecology. I went to the University of East Anglia in Norwich in England, and I think there were something like 400 applicants, 16 spots, and I got one of them. And after a year of study, and so I was studying only ecology, and then the environmental science students would come in year two or year three and do certain units in it. And I remember them distinctly having their mind blown because they just couldn't really get it. And I guess over the course of 30 years, I have learned to change my way of wondering about ecology because it's so complex that you cannot understand it. I guess we're taught in the early stages of my career or my education and training, we're taught to break things down. So that's what you do experimentally, right? You control for all the outside factors and you distill something down to a single objective that you're trying to experiment with to prove or disprove a certain hypothesis. And that gives you it doesn't give you the overall picture, okay? And that kind of worked at the time because people were discovering about it. It was a new discipline. And now, cast forward 30 years, all of a sudden we're faced with these fundamental problems with ecosystems and the need to understand their complexity. And so you can't think that way. And so really all of this began by an epiphany moment a few years ago where I suddenly kind of went, okay, I think I know how to think about this differently. And I rebuilt effectively my entire learning from ground up. I had to disregard everything I'd learned, which actually sent me down that kind of eco-anxiety line more and more. And so it's been incredibly cathartic to free up my mind and think. I think actually now think in a more natural way, think in a way that humans were made to think in a way that is far more sustainable, in terms of our own mental health, but also it's the way that we as animals enable ourselves to make correct decisions in the environment we live in. And we've kind of lost our path along the way and created
Ah,
all these problems for ourselves. And so for
well,
me, it's just been, I'm in a much happier place now and
I love
as
that for
well.
you.
Thank you.
A lot of our listeners may not be quite there yet. And I think you've really touched on something there, because I think about this a lot when we talk about public health, when we talk about environments, ecosystems, collapse, all the things. I see so much information online that actually, either deliberately or not, look, I think everybody's coming often from their best possible place of their ability to communicate, understand, make a call to arms. But it nevertheless ends us up either denying and keeping the box shut because that is just too big, too much. And it's actually easier to deny because that's safer for me than even trying to understand that, or admitting maybe someone else is right and I'm wrong. There's
Or if
that.
I, or if I can cut in, we deny ourselves the chance to do something about it because we also, I think it comes from the same place.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched on this a second ago. There's a lot of people, I spend an enormous amount of time in discussions with people about why they shouldn't worry so much. And you wouldn't believe the knockback I get from that. And it's quite vitriolic in some cases. In fact,
Yeah.
I probably get more negativity from the community who are engaged in conservation these days than I do from outside. It's really shifted over 20 years. And that's quite it. And I actually think it's quite astonishing. And I probably something that's come as a bit of a surprise from talking to people now, having written, is just how much of an obstacle that's become to our future progress. It's probably a bigger problem than biodiversity loss and climate change.
I could not agree more, because we spend so much time fighting about how to be a good climate change person instead of actually doing stuff.
Yeah.
And so the next bit that I wanted to share, just to kind of complete what I was saying, was the other aspect to the sharing online is often that people shut the door, ignore, or they end up so stressed and so apocalyptically minded that when you're in fight or flight, you cannot contribute in a meaningful, calm way to community or the local veggie patch, let alone the whole world. And I
It's
think
that
a lot of
simple.
people are
Yeah.
quite paralyzed.
And I was reading figures the other day that over half of people in New South Wales self-diagnose as suffering significant eco-anxiety. One in
Gosh.
10 are suffering from acute eco-anxiety. That's a scary figure because if you know anything about the sort of traumatic side of that, I very luckily work closely with a guy who is a trauma counsellor. He actually works in conservation programs with me. It's an incredible person to have along on the journey when we're engaging with the communities, because he understands this side of the mind so well. But he says that it's that trauma response, and in many cases it feeds on itself. So if I feel bad, I kind of project that onto others to try and make myself feel good. But that, in fact, so when you've got half of the population feeling the same way, it's not a good place to be. And I actually think this is a challenge.
Hang on. Hang on.
Yeah.
So basically, if we feel that bad, it somehow feels comforting to help other people feel as bad as we feel.
Look, I'm not an expert on this, but it's kind of the impression I get. There's this
Yeah.
kind of I read this all the time. So I open up LinkedIn in the morning and things like that, and I read, and there's this constant battle between let's all try and make each other feel as bad as possible, because if we don't, no one will do anything about it. But that goes against the grain of almost everything we understand. Not just about. I don't come at this from a psychologist's perspective, because I'm not one. But I look and learn from animals in nature and our interaction with them. And I look at the way that animals coexist with each other, and the way that those processes and patterns form that stabilize structures. And in stabilizing those ecosystem structures, it provides the certainty and clarity that things need to not be chronically stressed, right? So that's the same in the animal kingdom. There was a beautiful paper came out a few years ago by a New South Wales scientist about the koala stress. And chronic stress in koalas causing chlamydia is caused by lack of knowing where food is. It's the uncertainty. They've actually got higher levels of stress from that than they do from being attacked by a dog. Okay, and again, that so if we can remove the uncertainty and the anxiety about it, then automatically we become less stressed and automatically more able to conduct ourselves and make decisions and more instinctively, and just perhaps we become a little bit more locally focused and on the real problems in life, which is at the
One
end of
would
the day.
hope, because
Yeah.
the danger in eliminating uncertainty and trying to find safety is polarization, which we see. If
Yeah.
I just choose a camp, I will be safer than if I kind of float around the middle. And that's, so it's almost like we actually need to start getting comfortable with the fact that we can't know everything so that we can actually become able to do something.
Absolutely, absolutely perfect. Yes, exactly. Understanding makes the mind lazy. Penelope Fitzgerald from the bookshop. I love it. I love
Yes,
that quote.
definitely.
If we stop thinking instinctively and just letting our mind wander and imagine and create and think of all the possibilities, we stagnate. And I think social media hasn't helped this, and in environmental science as well, is going down the same rabbit hole. It's like we can fix all these problems, all we've got to do is more science. And so it's kind of like, oh, so A, somebody else is dealing with it, B, we've got the solution, it's going to come if we ask somebody. But those solutions actually don't come from a person, they come from this broader complex system of social society and ecosystems, and we've kind of moved all our processes away from that. And so what I like to see happen more is, and what we're actually working on this at the moment, is bringing communities more to the front and re-enabling those parts of the mind where we can learn from each other and make far more instinctive and wiser choices about our future economies and environment.
Yes.
It's very possible to do that.
It is possible. So let's start unpacking things. And I think we should unpack things from the animals themselves, how they set up ecosystems, and what we can learn from in that for our own daily lives. How does it impact us as humans, and how can we start to actually rebuild a sense of understanding and connection to do what's next?
Yeah. So I guess let me just wind back slightly, and I will briefly mention the how to survive the next 100 years, because the reason I wrote that was after the first book, people were left kind of with it. Some people were left with that doubt, like, oh, it made me feel bad. I'm like, oh, I can't understand that, because it actually made me feel really good at understanding how this works. And so I sort of embarked on this idea that because I don't think things are that bad. I don't see it that way. And I spend a lot of time in very powerful places with a lot of existing nature. And perhaps I look at it slightly differently. As I sit here in my garden now, I can see the shadow of a bird there. I can hear birds calling over there, and there's a pigeon over there. There are 3 animals currently doing things. The amount of stuff going on just in this tiny little area is quite extraordinary. Constantly turning over energy and feeding on different things and picking up waste off the ground. And it's extraordinary, even in an urban setting, how much wildlife activity there is. And so I started thinking of it from that perspective. And if I had to capture it in its essence, when you look for the examples of where wildlife recovery is happening, it's astonishing. So first of all, animals are recovering their populations themselves on vast levels. So ignore for the fact at the moment there are things going extinct. There are also an equal number of things increasing. And we just don't even look at those. In fact, we're more likely to call them pests than go, hang on a minute, right? If that animal is increasing that fast in number, what does that tell us about the ability for nature to rebound? Blimey, that's pretty amazing, right? But we ignore it to our peril, and we just look at the other side. Okay, so that's the first thing. So there's these monumental shifts happening, and with those monumental shifts has come, I think, an incredibly rapid change in our relationship with wild animals. So in the 50 years I've been on this earth, I have never seen a time where so many people are engaged in nature and interested in it as today. It is phenomenal. It's absolutely amazing. And everybody seems to want to do something. Everyone's aware of the animals around them. All of a sudden, they're kind of curious. And so humans are also doing things. They're enabling that. And where they are enabling it with objectivity, they're finding these outcomes that are surpassing all of their expectations. So there are examples of, in as little as 3 years, reintroducing a single animal into a landscape has increased farm profits and eradicated almost all of the worst environmental threats, such as flooding and weed invasion.
What? Where was this, and what was the animal?
Okay, so this is a wonderful story because it involves a partner of mine, a guy called Nigel Sharp, who is the founder of the Odonata Foundation. So in Victoria, Australia, is where we are, you have just outside Melbourne, a little mountain range called the Uyaks. And there's a predator-proof sanctuary there. And the history of that sanctuary is that a guy called John Walmsley. John Walmsley was a bit of a divisive character back in the 80s. He used to go around wearing a cat skin hat. And he was part of, he found out that they just rediscovered eastern barred bandicoots, previously thought extinct on mainland Australia, in old abandoned cars in a quarry in Hamilton in Western Vic. So he rescued them and put them into the sanctuary. He was kind of the early adopter of the idea that people could invest in nature, and it failed at the time. And in 2004, Nigel Sharp took over the sanctuary. In 2009, I first visited, and I went back there just a couple of years ago, and everything had changed. So now you've got thousands of bandicoots. It's kind of a living laboratory. They're experimenting with recreating an entire pyramidal structure of a food chain from top predators down in this area. Then a few years ago, Harry Youngman and Nigel Sharp, Harry runs a farm in Western Vic, just thought, well, I wonder what would happen if we put the bandicoots in there. Because they'd always done a lot of work on how they change the sort of soil carbon and everything else. In 3 years, they increased the tensile strength of wool on the farm, increasing the profitability of the farm. They know that there as a result of just the bandicoots digging and the increased porosity of the soil, and also the fact that you've got all these furrows and everything else, so and thicker and more organic layer of soil, so the water drains in, so they no longer have to do. It was $80 million spent on fence reconstruction just the other day in Queensland after floods. And weed pest management hasn't become such an issue either, because if you can imagine, right? So this is where ecology comes in. You have an absolute flat as a tack, completely uniform area of land that you've ploughed or sown or grazed to oblivion with sheep. And of course, the first thing that happens when you bring in a weed is it just takes over the whole area. But if you've got lots of furrows and ridges and lots of diversity, the weed can kind of start, but it can't really get anywhere because it's competing with lots of other things. So weed pest management just drops off. So all of a sudden, you've not got to deal with that as well. And
which means you can reduce your synthetic inputs if you're using those. And
we're talking, for each farm, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of less cost just by reintroducing a single animal. But the remarkable thing was, all of this took just 3 years.
That's incredible.
3 years. And so anyone who says it can't be done.
Yeah.
So I have this thing I say, is if you want, do you listen to the people who've done it and know how to do it? Or do you listen to the millions of people who tell you it can't be done and have never tried?
100%. And the thing is, when you share a story like that, it's so obvious how often we talk about introduced species, whether animals or plants, as being the most awful, terrible, invasive. That's the only stories we know about this. We don't know about regenerative and strategic reintroduction of species. I don't think that's being talked about enough.
Well, again, ecology is a very poorly understood subject in general. There are a few, but it's also very easy to understand because it kind of makes common sense. So I'll give you another example. I live about 200 metres from the Red Bluff Cliffs in Bayside, Melbourne. It's an area of extreme coastal erosion, and we've had a lot of erosion recently. And I was walking along the cliffs the other day, and the council contractors are out, and they're removing African boxthorn, which is a noxious weed. But they're not removing a bit of it, they're removing the whole lot. And I looked at it and I thought, this is a bit odd, because if you take out the structural remnants of vegetation like that in their entirety, and then you get a big storm, you're going to lose all the soil and increase the erosion there. Now, an ecologist won't do that. An ecologist will say, if you're going to take it out, what you have to do is take out some, plant something in the meantime, let that come up, take out another bit. So it might be a phased thing over kind of 4 or 5 years where you get the outcome you're looking for. But that result, whilst it takes a little bit more thought, doesn't cost more to do because the outcome is what you wanted. Whereas if you do it the other way, you just end up creating more problems than you solve. And this is the thing, where we create more problems than we solve. So the idea of lessons from nature is to say, well, there are already things the ecosystem does for us that we can see. And the things that animals do for us all the time that we pretty much already know what those are. We don't really need to do any more study on this, right? We know.
That's it. It's like people who have imposter syndrome. They think, if I only just do one more course or one more certificate or one more diploma, then I'll be able to start helping people. And I think we have the same thing in environmental regeneration. It's like, Which, we've got to make sure we have studied enough so that we know for sure what the answer is. But then if you look at the world, I mean, how many ecosystems are there? I mean, we could be studying forever and never start
Right.
anything.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So there's this wonderful story in the book Wilding by Isabella Tree about Scottish thistles, which in the UK are a noxious weed. And so they were already on the nose, rather, in terms of weed management, with the neighbouring properties having a go at them and scientists having a go at them for not using pesticides to kill these weeds. And so these thistles turned up, and then they thought, what do we do? And she explains that it took all of the fibre of her being not to do something, but they're like, the whole idea of this is to let nature take its course and see what happens. And what happened was that the thistles grew, sure enough. And then that summer, there was a huge influx of migratory red admiral butterflies from Africa. And they settled on the thistles and they bred. And then a few weeks later, they were covered in caterpillars. And the caterpillars ate the thistles down to the absolute stem. And then because they've been re-enabling the soil processes, and they had a lot of ants and ant hills or whatever throughout this area, the ants then came up and they took the remaining parts of the thistles, chewed them down and pulled them into the ground. And within a few weeks, it was all gone. And she said they could have sprayed the whole lot, but they would never have known that this was even a possibility if they hadn't. You learn from that the idea that it's sometimes better to just step back. When I used to work with, when I did my consultancy from time to time with the mining industry years ago, they used to have this principle, step back 5 by 5. Step back 5, it takes 5 steps back and 5 seconds to think about what you're doing before you do it. It's a safety protocol. And I think we need to bring in that. Step back 5 by 5. Maybe it's step back 50 yards and take 5 months to think about what you're about to do before you embark on interfering with a process ecologically, which inevitably will just set the clock back again. So we're constantly setting the clock back over and over, and we're never actually making progress, because the progress we need is driven entirely by animals, not by us.
And I remember when I first learned about factory farming, and it would have been nearly 20 years ago now. And I thought, okay, does this mean I need to go vegetarian or vegan or, all this kind of stuff? I started researching and learning, and I tried it, and it definitely wasn't for me. I thought, well, can you be a meat eater, and can that be a good thing? And what would that look like if it was? And I came across Joel Salatin's work, who was one of the earliest, most vocal kind of regenerative farming with his polyface farm movement. And I just love how he says, we don't want to ever make an animal not do its job. And if you can set your ecosystem up so that the pig is being the most piggest pig of all the pigs, and the chickens are being the most chickens of all the chickens, and the cows are being the most cowy cows, and you let them do their thing, but you guide them into different rotational systems, then you actually end up with incredibly healthy, diverse environments and animals that are getting to be themselves in their lives and happy, and great food for humans while we repair landscapes. And some of the desertification reversal work that I've seen farmers do around the world in using animals by letting them be themselves is extraordinary. I mean, you really have to sort of seek it out and find it. It's not shown on the news.
No, absolutely. No, you're right. You really do. And so what you're touching on there is this whole idea of animal autonomy. That's right. It's allowing, just letting animals be animals, and that evolves into the idea of personhood, law and rights of nature, which is not this. When you mention personhood and rights of nature to people, they tend to recoil a bit, think, giving rights to animals. It's not about giving rights to animals as much as giving ourselves the right to allow an animal to do what it does for us so that we can survive better. And so we can be anthropocentric about this. And that's another thing I get criticized for sometimes. Why are you being so anthropocentric? I'm like, if you knew me, you'd know I'm not. But also there's no point in not being, because we're part of this same system, right? And we all work functionally together, us and all the animals. And once you recognize that, it enables something new and something different. And so part of everything I do is trying to get that story told and get people thinking slightly differently about their place among wildlife, and realizing that, and also understanding that some of the biggest things we can do to reverse the worst problems we have right now in our society, you can achieve by just letting animals populations come back.
Yeah. So can we let's make this really local to what most people listening would have an experience of. And that would either be the nature strip, say, between two apartment blocks, or the back communal, laundry and hang your clothes area if you're in an apartment situation, or your backyard, which however big your house is or farm is, you're all going to have like a backyard.
Yeah.
The immediate bit of nature. What's happening out there that we can learn from and that we can allow to happen better as owners or custodians of whatever plot of land we live near?
Okay, so it's a big question because I think it's a process. There's no individual answer. It's a bit like, how can I buy a wellness for myself or something like that? People are looking for an answer. So
welcome to Simon's 3-day seminar kind of vibe.
Well, it's like, so people are looking for an answer to be presented to them. And I always feel uncomfortable doing that because I don't think there is such an answer. And also it's not my place to potentially provide it. But so I flip it round and would say, one of the things I like to look at is, I've stood in front of a few crowds recently and said, 10 years ago, how many people had veggie patch, you or anyone else you knew? And everyone's like, I said, what about today? And everyone's like, oh, everyone. And I go, right, okay. Why did that happen? Was it a policy change? And they're like, no. I'm going, okay, so why? See, when you understand ecosystems and you understand the sheer unmitigated power of nature to hold us to account, you'll begin to spot things happening in your society that you realize are happening for reasons that you can't explain. And no human or animal made that decision. We all adapted in this kind of collective unconscious way. And we're doing it anyway, right? So that's the first and really exciting thing about it. The next thing is how to influence your local area. And this is where I coin this idea of rewilding our minds. So we think that the way to fix our local environmental problems is by going out and doing weed management or something like that. Now, that's part of it, right? But it's not the biggest thing we can do. The biggest thing we can actually do is start spreading the story of how important that is to our society and influencing all of us to think about the possibilities that would happen to our cost of living, for example, will decline if we restore it and everything else. So I have 3 questions I generally ask. Let's see if I can remember these in order. Well, the first question is, I say to people, do you go out regularly to seek time in nature as part of your work-life balance, for want of a better expression, okay? And everyone will say yes, okay? And then the second question I said is, can you describe to me, therefore, the place you go to and what features of that place make it special for you? And the answer is yes. Okay. So with those 2 questions in mind, then does it matter if that place you go has a healthy ecosystem or not? Of course, the answer is yes. So if you actually scrape the surface, whatever demographic of society you come from, we all seek the same basic time in nature. So then I've been throwing the net out and asking rooms full of people to estimate the percentage of their personal productivity throughout their working week that depends on that. And the figures are quite extraordinary. So we get anything from like 40 to 60% of people in a room will, overall, on average, will say that between 40 and 60% of their personal productivity is entirely dependent on having that time in nature. So we're underestimating how much that drives our productivity. Because if you think about it, our economy is entirely built on our own ability to work or be productive in society. And so if you take away 40 to 60% of the natural part of that, you've got no economy left. And so things collapse. Your whole resilience to everything collapses. You become anxious, chronically so. You've got all these other issues. And it becomes impossible, like we were saying earlier, to make a difference. So I think the first thing I say to people is I would recommend that you regularly, when you go out, you think very deeply about your connection and you start talking about that to everybody else in your neighborhood. Because if you can influence 50 other people and everyone does that, within 2 years, your entire community will be making wiser decisions to protect its environment. And then if you want to lobby and push for it all, whatever, but if we can't get that right, we will never fix the problem but it's all out there for us to just see. Literally, nature just got it laid out on a plate for us. All you have to do is step outdoors and you can see it in action, literally everywhere. I can't walk anywhere without seeing this. Now, I might just point out, Alex, that years ago I wasn't like this. Years ago, after I studied ecology, I was broken. I was taught every time. I went through this period of my life where every time I looked at something, I saw it for the problem that it was, and that thing was dying or going extinct or declining. I don't have evidence for that. In many cases, things are probably doing quite okay, right? But it just occupied my mind the whole time. And now I very much think the opposite. I look at things and think, oh, there's actually stuff really thriving out there, and we need to value that now, and we can turn that cycle of desperation around. We can turn it into a cycle of restoration.
And don't you think that that's a little practically hard to do because the messaging is often of everything that's going wrong rather than anything that's going right?
Yeah, look. So the other bit of advice is turn off the news. Everyone, turn off the news. Turn off the news for 1 month and tell me you don't feel better after it.
Okay, I get that, and I, for one, do not watch very much news at all. So I think
do you know? I don't think you're alone. I think increasingly this is happening. People are turning the news off a lot.
I do think though, like there is a part where we do need to know how to advance the things that we want to see more of in the world. And so what is the most productive and sure, if we can even be sure, way to learn good things, to inform good action rather than learn bad things that make us scared, that drive us to inact, if that
so
makes sense.
I think it's the same thing. So turn off the news, get a pair of binoculars or a mask and snorkel, spend as much of your time as possible immersed in nature, no distractions, otherwise it doesn't work, right? And just jump on the internet and Google it. I'd be hard-pressed to live anywhere in the world and not find a local project of some sort that's created a positive outcome. And just go and find out about it. You don't even have to necessarily be part of it. You just need to contribute, just be aware of it. Right? Read about it. There are things going on in this neighborhood here. So you mentioned nature strips. There's this wonderful project by Village Zero in Sandringham Bayside, and they are just about to embark on work with local people to rewild with insect life the nature strips and corridors throughout this entire area. It's a tiny, simple project, but it's going to have huge ramifications for the way people think about their local area, local kids' education. It will improve in ways we don't even know yet. There's another project in Melbourne, the Swimmable Yarra project. They are literally going door to door of every resident and business in 29, I can't remember, 2,500 streets to get them involved in this project, and they will clean up the Yarra. It will happen. There's no doubt about it. It's just taking that commitment and it's a grassroots community initiative. And in that case, it's the going out and telling that story and meeting people. It's actually getting people to think differently, to understand the possibility is the biggest hurdle to get over. Once that's done, it happens very fast. And there's this wonderful example from Judith Schwartz's book, The Reindeer Chronicles, by Jeff Goebel of the Community Consensus Institute, who went to Mali. And he brought several warring tribal factions together. So there's nothing compared to what first world problems that we have. These people were suffering critical food insecurity, and they were at war with each other because of it. And he said just by reframing the conversation about what was possible, he invited a new style of thought. And whilst he said he left going, I wonder if this is going to work, 2 years later they invited him back. They'd stopped fighting and they were, look at what we've done, and they had grown their food and they'd reversed their problems. And all it took was a change in their mind to do that. You've got to remember, I guess, Alex, that this is another kind of pet. Sorry, I'm going on a bit here, but this is one of my pet ideas, is that we are, our brains float above the earth. The only thing that connects us to planet Earth really is our minds, okay, apart from the fact we eat and whatever. But to get to where we are, to do what we need to do to eat, everything we do is conducted by this organ that floats in space above everything else and is disconnected. We don't have roots, we don't have mycorrhizae like fungi, right? So if we can't have our brain aligned and instinctively thinking about what to do and use the creative and imagination part of it to come up with inventions and ideas to actually progress our society, we will fail.
Yeah.
So that's the obstacle. And I think anyone out there who's listening who's suffering from eco-anxiety, it's very solvable in no time at all just by getting back into nature.
Wow. I mean, I actually struggle with that as a potential solution. I'm like, but what are we doing? But where are we donating the money? But how are we not one of the things you talk about is the planting of trees, and that not being possibly the best return on investment of our time and care and money. Or, so many businesses say, we've planted a tree with your order. And we think that's good. I'm a good person because that's the kind of business I buy from. And I don't think anyone is a bad person in this chain of loveliness. But at the same time, can you share for us then what's wrong with the tree planting as the we've done a good thing and I'm off and going to enjoy the rest of my day? If a healthy home is your priority right now, then Oz Climate, our major podcast partner, without whom we could not put this show on every week, has got you covered with 10% off for Aussies. Code LowToxLife. Dehumidifying is a particular passion of mine because it helps us prevent moisture, excess humidity, and of course, therefore, mold in our indoor environments. Of course, if you ever have a leak or a flood, contact a mold technician or a building biologist. But for everyday living, you would be surprised the impact that good dehumidification can make in your indoor environment. I've done a ton of reels on this to help you know how long, what size of unit, how many units, different floor plans. Everything's there on my Instagram at LowToxLife, and you'll see all the white background tiles are part of a humidity literacy series. I hope it helps you. Head to ozclimate.com.au. They have heating and cooling solutions, amazing dehumidifiers, and their Winix air purifier range.
So again, it's a bit like, isn't it? It's a bit like investing $30 in feeling better. I want to be well, so I'm going to go and spend this time with this guru for half an hour, and then I'm going to be just like they are.
Show me the guru that only costs $30 half an hour. My gosh, not in 2025.
So it doesn't work. You have to change yourself. So I've had people come to me and say, I had to recommend ecotourism experiences, and I go, there's no such the ecotourism. I said the ecotourism experiences will find you once you change your behavior, right? So it's the same. Mm-hmm. It's the same kind of thing. So buying a tree. Look, there's nothing inherently wrong with tree planting, right? Let's get that right. But so there's two aspects to this. One, if we plant trees without considering the ecosystem function, the trees can actually become an impediment to carbon processes and so on. So we actually don't create, from a scientific basis, we don't create the systems that we need to enable other things like food security and everything else, right? So really, if you're going to be planting a trees, you need to be planting a forest as defined with all the species that occupy it, right? You need to be having a plan to bring all of that back in one go as a functioning system, right? And that is possible to do as well. Tree planting is also used, obviously, just as you implied, for people to just feel better that they've done something. But I would much prefer that people actually just went out and enjoyed nature for a while and got their head in order first, because from that will come caring and responsibility and changing behavior. It's transformational. And then it enables those of us who work in sort of community-led conservation to do it a lot more easily, because people then are more engaged and want to be part of something that makes a real difference. So when my local cafe said to me the other day, where do I invest money? We'd like to put some money aside from coffees to give to the local community and nature. I said, come back to me in 3 years, because we're currently building the project. I could tell you right now where to spend it, but I can't guarantee it's going to make any difference. But we will know that shortly, because we're working with the community at the grassroots to understand the system they live in and to find ways of actually taking action that has measurable outcome, that's not just good for the environment, but also good for our local economy. Much wiser way of doing it. And invest it locally. Don't send it to a scheme. Again, I'd be careful. There's nothing wrong with donating to charities overseas, but don't forget you also live here. Yeah. And you could be benefiting from it as well, with all the people who live around you in your own community.
Yeah, wow. And so what I'm really hearing there is we have to remember what is worth fighting for, of course. We have to remember how beautiful things are and how magical things are in our natural habitats. to think, well, what do I want to do within that? And that takes time in nature. I fully understand that. And as I was hearing you, I sort of came up with this metaphor of, like, imagine, if you will, you were a smoker of the traditional kind of cigarette, and you reached across to your most beloved husband or wife and you put the cigarette out on their cheek, even though you said you love them and you've committed to them for life and it's all great, but you've done that. You couldn't do that to someone you loved and respected. And so then I thought of the person who just tosses the ciggy butt on the road as they're driving down a highway. But if you sat in that field and you fell in love with the little, bee and the flower and the whole, you couldn't put the cigarette just out that window. And is that kind of where you're leading us? Like, it's the deep appreciation piece that's actually so important to the overall improvement of our ecosystem.
Yeah, but also, I'd be inclined to empathize with the person who's got the problem with smoking the cigarettes and realize that they might need some help. And
totally, it was more just a metaphor of the extinguish act of like
I said
carelessness.
That for a very key reason, though, because following a recent event, I was lambasted for not putting climate change up front in center in a talk. Not that the talk was really about it, but the person who attacked me online. Actually, I don't say attack. Okay, it's a wrong word, strong word. I got an email. When someone writes an email to you, it's a very considered thing. They've spent a lot of time thinking about what they're going to say. Now, their words aren't always very well chosen, and I made that point when I wrote back to them. But I had a choice to write something horrible back. But then I thought, there's pointless doing this because this person's obviously suffering a great deal of pain and anxiety about this. And so I sent something back really, really nice and offered some options to read different things. But I was also quite clear on those words you've used there. Like, how can scientists like you possibly be so ignorant about climate change? They're not. Why did you say that? It's interesting because you can't possibly think that I don't know about this. It's something I've heard about every day for the last 30 years. And I've not heard back, but I think it's important to understand that we do have this broader problem where that's it. The majority of human beings, Alex, just want to know, they want to know what they can do. But we're also time poor. So if I started suggesting to people that what they need to do is to donate all this money, spend all this time, people are going to go, I just don't have the time to do that.
And now don't have the money in so many cases as well.
And the reality is actually that you don't need to do that. That we're part of a functioning system. Actually, what I like to think about is when I'm snorkeling on a coral reef and I've got just gargantuan numbers of fish in front of me of every shape, size, and dimension possible. There's areas I go where there's about where there's 400 species of fish on a single spot, and there could be 2,000 species of fish within a short distance, right? We know that each fish only does a certain role. So there's only actually 2 or 3 fish species globally, in only one spot that actually do the same function. So it's the kind of marketplace of fish that creates a functioning economy or the ecosystem. Okay, so essentially, if you look at an actual marketplace and you took away any of those roles, like the delivery drivers, or the vendors or whatever, or the people who put up the stalls at the start of the day or take them down at the end of the day, everything collapses very quickly. Okay, so you're part of a system that enables things to happen, and we're all part of that same system. And some of us are doctors and nurses and teachers and whatever, and you go, oh, you've got to stop doing all that because you've got to go and do weed management. No, we all have a role to play, right? So what we can do, I genuinely believe that in the next 10 years we're going to begin to get ourselves to a point where we'll be able to see a vision for ourselves where we can go to work in the knowledge that we're not having a overall negative impact on our local environment, and we can go out into our local environment outside of that time knowing that the contribution that's making to our own personal well-being is having an equal and intensive impact on the productivity that enables us to do the rest of it. That we can get ourselves to that position, and all it takes is knowing that we can do it and actually just getting on with it. And that means that people don't have to feel that they're constantly guilted or anxious about doing too much or doing too little. You do what you can. Everyone does their bit, and that's all it takes.
Yeah, and it is, I think half the time it's actually getting to the point where you truly believe that a small thing that you do matters, right?
Yeah.
Because, there's that meme, one straw doesn't matter, said 8 billion people. And then, of course, yes, it does matter. But conversely, a tiny positive action also matters collectively. I think a lot of people are struggling because we do have this late stage GDP effects capitalism scenario where you do have a very high concentration of wealth in a very small group of people who live a certain way while we all recycle our, bottles and try and use our coffee grounds in the compost and, do all the little things. And then you see this horrific waste and impact, and it can make people really jaded. Have you got any advice for people to think it's, even when you see that, it's still worth it?
Well, first of all, obviously consume less. It's one of the things you need to try to do. Look, I go back to the pair of binoculars. I wrote about this in the first book. My pair of binoculars last 30 years and they don't have batteries.
Yeah.
And I've seen every bird and animal I've ever seen through them. I mean, the joy that brings, and they just keep going. Okay. So certainly consume less. But the other thing that we have to be fundamentally aware of is first of all, how long change takes to occur. And also how hard it is to imagine that happening, because there are changes happening, for example, around climate change, fossil fuel at the moment. I think all the time there's countries reporting their first days or months where they've been entirely on renewable energy and that kind of thing. The transformation's been very, very rapid. Not as rapid as we'd like to have had, but it's happening. I want people to imagine like a ball of wool. So the last 50 years, we all live the lives we live today because we have been very successful. Our economy has been very successful. We built an existence for ourselves, which we've profited from, all of us. So we all have a responsibility for this. And that ball of wool is it's like all the incumbent legislation policies that we've developed to enable served us very well. And all of a sudden, because it's a tipping point, it's no longer fit for purpose, and everyone's racing around trying to work what to do. And like a ball of wool, you can't grab a thread and yank it really hard to kind of run away with it, because it just tangles it even tighter. And you can't cut it with scissors, because then you've got nothing to rebuild anything with. So part of the process is to slowly tease apart the threads that you can get and unravel those. And if anyone's, I don't know how old your listeners are, but I can remember sitting with my mum as a kid, while she's untangling a ball of wool.
Yeah, I can remember that too.
Wrapping it around your fingers so that she can then use it to knit another garment. It's a process, okay? So there's actually probably 95% of the time is spent enabling that process, and the 5% of the time at the end is it suddenly happens, and everyone goes, "Oh, that was good," And that happens all the time through society. And so ebbs and flows. It's always worth understanding that is part of a process. And again, you have to look under the hood. You have to immerse yourself very carefully online and actually find that information about the progress, because, as you said earlier, it's just overwhelmed with all this top heavy,
everything
all
that's
failing,
wrong.
everything's terrible, everything's terrible. You're like, well, actually, it's a temporal thing. It's going over time. You got to look at that. You got to look at the transition, and that's really hard to do. Yeah, it is hard. I think it'd be really nice to have a couple of the examples talked about from your book, because you talk about some really specific stuff that's quite eye-catching as like a chapter title. And I'm like, what? Tell me how grasshoppers, eels, and blue gropers teach us how to solve the obesity crisis. I mean, I'm interested. Okay.
So I think that'd be a really good one to unpack.
Okay, well, so we've been talking today about the local gardens, a little bit about food and farming and everything else, and so there's this wonderful gentleman called Professor Oswald Schmitz from Yale University, and he's one of the leading minds in biodiversity carbon. So this is the part of the carbon cycle that is, rather than sequestered into the atmosphere as CO2, is brought back into organic processes that enable life. Okay. So what Schmitz says is that it's when he first started studying animals, like everyone, he wanted to study the big stuff, the bison. All that money was gone. There's no way he was getting into bison, so he had to make do down in the dirt with the grasshoppers and the spiders. And so, but he said that in hindsight, it was a really positive thing, because he said you can manipulate those ecosystems in ways that you can't manipulate bison.
Mm.
So they did this experiment where they removed the predatory spiders from a landscape. So this is the jumping spiders and wolf spiders, the ones that are like the lions of the grassland. They're chasing or pouncing. Okay. The web building spiders remained, okay, and something really curious happened. So the grasshoppers, who are obviously the herbivores, and it's important at this point to note that Schmidt says that a particular species of grasshopper doesn't compete with, say, a bison or an antelope here. He said he calls them analogs. So he said this species of grasshopper and this bison are basically acting on the same ecological plane, just at a slightly different scale, okay. So you can study this one and know what it happens to this one. So they'll be equivalent in this part of the ecosystem with human beings, for instance.
Right.
He says, so what happened was, he said the grasshoppers, because now they weren't suffering from, they weren't surrounded by these pouncing predators, they could move further. So they would move towards juicier, richer, more sugary and carbohydrate-rich food. It's a bit like when we drive along and we're getting a bit peckish.
And you go to your highway pit stop. Yeah.
Exactly. 7-Eleven slushy, a chocolate bar, right?
Yeah.
And so they'd move and they'd start eating the sugary food. And when you consume sugar, it enables, I think, I don't know the details of exactly how this works, but it means you become more chronically stressed. And chronic stress actually feeds on itself and makes you want to crave more sugar. So you get into an obesity cycle. There's actually a reason for this. They ended up with fat grasshoppers.
Wow.
These poor obese grasshoppers. Simply because they changed the environment around the grasshoppers. Okay. So now, a couple of interesting things was that when the grasshoppers died, these obese grasshoppers died.
Did they die early?
Well,
do we know?
They tend to. There's a whole ecology around that's quite complex as well. It's one of the reasons why you have locust plagues is because they're getting low on food, so they get stressed. They then seek sugary food. They then transform into a different type and they move. So migration, the need to actually move to another place, is kind of a response to declining local food, nutrition, and so on. There's a whole science behind that. But what happened when they died was their body chemistry didn't have the same molecular makeup as it did for the fitter, more proteinaceous grasshoppers elsewhere. And the microbes in the soil, therefore, couldn't metabolize their bodies. And the amount of carbon sequestered into the soil declined by 50 times.
What? Wow.
50 times. So these chronically stressed grasshoppers that were moving further, worried about the web-building spiders, getting a bit nervous, eating sugar, getting into this cycle of depression, anxiety, and obesity. Already your listeners are going, that sounds familiar.
Sounds a bit like someone I know.
It's familiar because it is exactly what we've done to our own society, right? We've actually enabled chronic stress through other means. One of the things you learn when you study ecosystems is our personal choice has very little to do with anything. When it comes to societal level issues, it's the outside environment putting pressure inwards that creates that change. That's why we're not really in control. Okay. So anyway, so obviously by putting they're putting the predators back in the system, what that enabled was more acute stress response, which is the good stress. But it also meant that because the grasshoppers couldn't go as far, it's a bit like if so rather than you driving down the road and being able to pop to the 7-Eleven, get your slushy, instead what I've done is it's late in the evening, you're hungry, and I've laid down in front of you a heap of different foods of different types, protein and carbohydrate. You can, like a grasshopper, and all animals on Earth can pick almost the precisely perfect balance of protein and carbohydrate to enable your survival and society's survival. Because we've taken away the opportunity. We've brought it back in with Uber Eats, of course.
Yeah.
But we took away that opportunity. Your mind goes back to how it was and you make the perfect food choice. Okay, so this is what happened with the grasshoppers when they reintroduced the spiders, and subsequently carbon goes up massively into the soil.
If you're an Aussie listening and local made, local owned is a priority for you, I want you to meet the beautiful brand Pure Earth. Gabriella and her team are so passionate about minimizing plastic, the power of natural ingredients and what they can do for the health of our skin, the health of our hair. And I especially love the amazing Kakadu Plum Vitamin C Serum, which is 99% Kakadu Plum. That's it. The rest is a small amount of natural preservatives. So if you haven't checked out their hair, body care and face products, head to pureearth.com.au, 20% off for the month of July, code LOWTOXLIFE. Thank you for...
Now, human beings seek acute stress responses, sport, exercise. We generally go and seek that outdoors, and we do it in nature, a lot of us, because it's the way our brains are connected. Okay? So everything we need to be comes from that. And so by and that protein and carbohydrate balance, by the way, is Robenheimer and Simpson, those Sydney-based researchers that revolutionized our understanding of food and human nutrition across the world. They work with Oswald Schmitz. So they took lessons from nature and have transformed the way we think about human nutrition. But if we rewild the landscape around where we live, and correspondingly we take lessons from nature ourselves, we kind of become the change that's needed to enable the things to happen on the ground that then feeds back up through us. So we go, as I said earlier, we turn this cycle of destruction into a cycle of restoration. And that's why, as I say, it's all about the mind. It's more about the way we feel, re-engaging with the parts of our brain that allows us to make instinctive, correct choices, rather than creating a system around us that disengages us. And the worst, of course, of that is destroying the nature around us and disconnecting us from nature in the first place, which is why, because we constantly seek that all moments of our lives. And it's so obvious.
It is so obvious. But this is where it is important to learn good enough information, have good enough dialogues politically with local members, especially local members. A lot of people worry about the top person and who that is. And it's those local people, like, what are you doing to reduce the chronic stress to stop us from becoming a locust plague? You know, like that is, we want to actually create healthy societies that don't have these artificial stressors that drive us to the high carb, immediate relief kind of dynamic. And we don't realize that when
and metaphorically speaking as well, like they say that.
That's kind of what I mean.
Diets of poor news, diets of poor information, diets of poor access to nature, all of
digital
that,
junk, you know, all of it. But
I would add that the other thing is, what's really important is not to seek the answers from our leaders. So, because they don't know the answers, you see. And so we spend a lot of time...
I think what I'm saying is that's where we also have the most influence.
Yeah.
Not look to them for the answers,
yes,
but look to them for the productive dialogue that changes the paradigm. I think, to start the productive dialogue, even if that's you, even if that's like someone else that you've found that's smart that you want to put in front of them, whatever. But we do actually have a systems change requirement for us to not even have that stupid food that has the eat responsibly or drink responsibly BS on it in the first place. I mean, I see these people getting excited about removing additives from cereals in the US right now. And sure, I mean, you know, better that they're not there, but we shouldn't be eating the cereals. You know, so let's just sort of start to think about what it looks like to have a system that actually the byproduct is healthy people and healthy animals.
I think what you're touching on, which is really perfect, is the idea that the answers to most of these problems are we already know, and we don't need science to tell us. And I love talking about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and deep thought. So 7.5 million years of being asked to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. He turns around to the scientists and says, "You're not going to like the answer." And of course, the answer is 42. And they're like, "What does that even mean? You've had all this time to think about it." And he says, "Once you understand the question you need to ask, the answer you'll already know the answer." Now, I've thought about that a lot recently because we're working with community groups on community co-designed plan to steward our local environment here. So rather than consult with the public and go to them and give them an answer, because interestingly, when I talk to people, they're like, "What would you do?" And I go, "I don't know. What would you do?" And they're like, "I don't know." I said, "Okay, so maybe we should have a conversation between everyone." So what happens is consultation is like, you're talking to me, I'm talking to you, but conversations that they go sideways. So we've got this fascinating thing happening at the moment where I've run 120 people so far being part of community workshops. And in the last workshop, a couple of really exciting things happened. People started to ask me really incredibly interesting questions, probing questions about what they're doing and what's going to happen. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay, so they're waking up to the idea of what's possible and they're beginning to inquire. But the other thing that's happening is they're asking questions of each other, and I'm not answering them. They're answering them. And so what occurs as a result of this process of conversations about how we can change the environment around us and an understanding about ecology, which is all built into what we do, answers reveal themselves, not the questions. So all of a sudden, there's going to be these moments where someone will go, oh, I've just had a great idea. We could do this and it would solve that problem. And you go, yeah, no one's ever thought of that before. But this is what's going to be, it's so exciting when you get communities involved because they think of ideas that are completely left field that will work. So the question then becomes, how do we do that? How can we as a community enable that to happen?
Yeah.
And how can it be resourced? So if you go to your local member and say, we've got this idea, we know how to do it, we know it'll work, we've got the people who can enable it, but we need some help to do X, Y, Z, they'll smile on you a lot more favorably than if you just go, oi, we're lost.
This is wrong.
This is wrong. And you're like, what's wrong? And they can't even describe the problem. But you're like, that's a problem in itself, you know?
And that is about like stopping to think the idea is outside of yourself and starting to think it's actually something you already know if you tune in for long enough to discover it.
So going back to one of your questions earlier about something people could do then. So I would say, if you have a few problems that you can foresee or things that annoy you, that you then think about what you can do to address any of those. Find the easiest one possible and make it your single determination to make it happen, but not by attacking other people for not doing it, but by finding out a way to do it yourself and bring some people along. And it doesn't matter if it can be the tiniest thing. It doesn't matter. Whatever you can do will matters, and you'll inspire so many other people to do the same or similar. It's all it takes. And I think that so you look at the Greta Thunbergs of the world and so on, and they kind of build this illusion like we've got to solve all the world's problems by really, really angry and argumentative and divisive. But no, you actually would be better off just choosing one small achievable thing that you can do and making that your ambition.
And Simon, what you have just said, that drives us into our local surrounds. Whereas what you were talking about before, influencer, eco-influence, drives us online, anxious and inactive, in my experience. Yes. I see more hope when I visit my local veggie patch or when I blend up my food scraps for the worm farm than I find ever online. How good are worm farms? I know, like, the best.
I got one quite recently, and
game changer.
I barely do anything. I actually went in there a bit guilty the other day. I'm like, oh, I haven't put anything in for a while. I hope they're okay. They're thriving.
They're pretty good. Intermittent fasting is their thing. Yeah, takes a lot to kill worms. Actually, that reminds me of the bit on parasites in your book. Do you have time to unpack that?
Oh, yeah, of course. Look, if you want to
keep going, that was pretty fascinating.
Very happy to. Okay, so one of the things that, it's a bit counterintuitive, but one of the things I like people to try to do early on is really understand how little we're in control of anything. And there are many examples in the world, some of which we've talked about today, but there are also these quite insidious and unpleasant examples as well that add up to something quite extraordinary. And one of these is toxoplasmosis.
Yeah, okay.
Which is a brain parasite that goes through the life cycle of cats and rats and dogs and whatever, and it infects the human brain. And it's actually becoming increasingly prevalent around the world. So much so that I think 1 in 5 people in Australia have toxoplasmosis of the brain. It's as many as 3/4 in South America.
What?
Parts of South America.
Does everybody know who does? Or is it that, like mystery illnesses and they just haven't actually pinpointed it yet?
Well, okay, so it's been well known. It's been known about for all time.
Well, I knew toxoplasmosis. I knew about it from cats, but I didn't know.
And if you've got it, you won't necessarily know you've got it. Okay. And in most people, it doesn't present as a problem. Okay, but it does cause substantial changes in behaviour. So there was a study on wolves that showed that infected male wolves were 46 times more likely to become pack leaders than uninfected males. Also, a study that shows that successful business students and leaders and politicians are far more likely to be infected with toxoplasmosis than those who are not. And how it manifests itself is in being less loyal, less liberal, and more anti-authoritarian, amongst other things, less compassionate and so on.
More anti-authoritarian.
Yeah, less compassionate,
Yeah.
less loyal, less liberal, and more anti-authoritarian, and it changes the way you vote.
Right. So you can be, hold on, how is less liberal and more okay, that means
Yeah.
more authoritarian. Got it. Sorry.
Yeah.
There were too many negatives
Too
and
many
positives
double
that I was trying to
negatives in there,
cancel
yeah.
them out.
Yeah.
Okay, all good, all good.
So all the best qualities of leaders. But the interesting part about it is, so first of all, obviously, that's having an enormous impact on our society already, and we are not
the silent
personally-
epidemic. It
Right.
just looks
Well,
like as
yeah.
we look around. Yeah.
Except it's also so normal. So it's part of an evolutionary process. And so the less savoury parts of our society are actually part of a driving force itself that enables things to progress. So I describe it sometimes as like a chariot, where the chariot driver's got a whip and they all of us, they're getting far too angry and they're driving the horses too fast and they're getting really, and everyone out, and things are kind of falling off and the wheels are starting to fall off and everything, and everyone else is behind sort of trying to pick up the pieces and keep it going. And eventually they just have to overthrow the chariot rider. But the horses and chariot is going forward. We need it going forward, but we just can't, from time to time, it falls apart. But it takes those of us who are more liberal and less anti-authority to pick up the pieces. So you've got this world of people in pain worrying they're not doing enough, or that they're not important because they're not leaders, or they're not important because they're not on the news or influencing. But it's not the point. They're very important because the world is actually enabled and supported by people who care and slow down and just do the humdrum stuff all the time. And that's fine. If those times, we're going through a time obviously at the moment with leaders who are and billionaires and so on who seem to be enacting too much control, that is going to collapse. There's no doubt about it. It cannot last. It is completely against all natural laws that can persist. It's only a matter of time. In the meantime, keep picking up the pieces and put a smile on your face. Don't worry about it quite so much, because it might be that they've just ate a bit of cat poo at some point.
I was just about to say, have you noticed yourself starting to hate your neighbours? Go get yourself checked out for toxoplasmosis. It just, wow. Okay.
I could tell you one more thing about toxoplasmosis if you like, which is
Go for
it
it.
depends whether it's good for your audience or not. So I found out this just the other day. So it's I'm rather glad actually it's not in the book. It's not as bad as you might think. So
Okay.
when toxoplasmosis it has to find its way back into the food system to get to the next vector, like a cat, right? So, and the clear way of doing that obviously is through feces, right? And so on. But scientists have discovered that rats, which is one of the ways that this cycle occurs, when exposed to toxoplasmosis, they get a bit amorous,
Right.
okay, and it was put by a particular online scientist that they would cozy up to cats and get a bit sexy with the cats. Now, I did a bit more reading about it. It's not actually true. What happens is that there are parts of our brain that relate to fear and parts that relate to sex and whatever. And what it does is it kind of correlates those two. So in a way, what happens is the rats become less fearful and a bit sexy, and the combination of that makes them more prone to be eaten by cats, and so the toxoplasmosis continues through the cycle.
Right.
So this other clever scientist thought, I wonder what that means for humans.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
So they did a study and determined that men and women who have toxoplasmosis are far more likely to engage in sadomasochism than those who do not.
Really?
Because the fear and sexual arousal parts of the brain effectively are tied together by the parasite.
Wow.
So there's these. So you can imagine, like, within our own body, that we already know there's gut fauna and everything else, but there's this whole ecosystem that that occurs right down to molecular level. Our proteins in our body are an ecosystem. We're actually made up of, there's more DNA in our body that is not chromosomal than otherwise. Like, actually, bananas have more chromosomes than human beings. What makes us able to adapt better is the fact that we have less chromosomal DNA and more ability for our proteins to adapt to the ecosystem around us. So the mere fact we're talking here right now and I'm sitting with the sun shining on me means that my body is creating different manifestations of its proteins to account for the way I feel, how cold it is, or whatever. And it's that, for complex beings like us, that's part of our survival adaptation. So
It's also part of why so many things go wrong with us, because we're more precarious. Yeah.
But that's also what makes us survive. And so we're kind of like Russian dolls, boxes right out to the universe. We are all the time being subjected to these outside pressures that shape and control the way humanity goes, which I think is a really beautiful, almost cosmic kind of idea. It's very magical and mysterious to think that we are just on this trajectory. We actually don't know where humanity is going to go next. Really?
No. We can only do our best in our local communities. Thank you for reminding us the power of that. Can I ask you one last question?
Yeah, of course.
Right now, your desert island little wildlife character and the jobs they do for us without us, most of us, I mean, you know, but most of us have no idea that they're doing these jobs. Who's your current fave?
Favorite character doing something? Well, I've got a real penchant for whales and dolphins, and so whales, probably whales, right? So it's not so much a little desert character.
No, that's actually quite a large desert character.
In the context of the global oceans, needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
So I love humpback whales are a great success story in Australia and something we all should know more about. But again, science hasn't really caught up with this because we've lived for the last 50 years only really studying the decline of things. And then quietly in the background, since whaling stopped, humpback whale numbers have increased from around about 5,000 animals when I first arrived in Australia 25 years ago to around 35 to 40,000 on the east coast today. So much so that you can go out of the east coast of Australia and see a whale every 15 minutes migrating up the coastline, right? So, but it's what they're doing that's really fascinating. So during COVID, I was employed to go and stand on cliff sides monitoring whales going past when the roads were closed. It was magical.
It's like your dream job. How good is that?
I've done this actually for much of my life. When I was a teenager, I used to go into the North Atlantic doing surveys of cetaceans, which is whales and dolphins. Anyway, so I stand on the headlands at Phillip Island and with a telescope and binoculars, and I was seeing what humpback whales feeding. Humpback whales have not been known to feed in Australian waters in living memory. And when it was first seen a few years ago, scientists were like, oh, wow, they're feeding. This is unknown to science. Turns out it's probably quite normal. It's just that the numbers are getting back to the point where it's beginning to happen. Something's shifted, something's triggered in the ecosystem, a tipping point, because you can watch these animals feeding from horizon to horizon. But it's not just the humpbacks. You've got a humpback whale rolling, coming up with the bait fish are flashing as its mouth's open. The gannets are plunging in around the head, which means there's probably salmon swimming around feeding on the bait fish. There are dolphins diving over the tail, seals, and tuna. So the whole ecosystem from top to bottom is pretty much represented in this one small view in a telescope, right? From horizon to horizon, because there's whales feeding all the way along. Now, these whales reintroduce nutrients into the ocean surface at millions of times greater than the surrounding seawater and promote algal growth, and enormous amounts of carbon sequestration, but they also do a lot of other things. So the seabirds, for example, transport nutrients that combine with algae on the surface, and sunlight creates sulfuric acid droplets that then seed clouds and can influence whole continental weather patterns. You've got the humpbacks alone are transporting 4,000 tons of nitrogen into tropical waters in the Great Barrier Reef each year. To put that into context, there's only 7,000 tons of nitrogen comes down the rivers every year into the Great Barrier Reef. 66,000 tons of nitrogen fertilizer is used for the entire farming infrastructure for the United Kingdom. So this is one animal doing all of that. And that's just one species of hundreds of species doing similar things, be they eels, seabirds, other dolphins, whales, everything. Right? So you've got this phenomenal thing happening, which is feeding weather systems, carbon cycles. It's most likely going to improve agriculture, but we won't know this because no one's going to study it, because you can't study it all because there's so much happening. So we're entering this new period in the planet where whilst we're on a bit of a precarious point with climate change, obviously we have to be aware of that. we've also got all these other things happening that are so monumental, and they're happening in front of our eyes. And if I didn't tell your listeners this, the chances are they probably wouldn't have heard about it, because I don't think I've ever read anybody who's spotted that gargantuan impact those animals are having now on entire ocean ecosystem processes. But it's there, and you can see it by just standing with a pair of binoculars on the coast, which I love.
That is so good. Well,
and then see it with everything else. Sorry, then every time you think about that story, and then look at every bird and animal, insect you see in your garden at different scales, and you'll see the same thing.
Wow.
That's
It is pretty fun. And so if you, Simon, had an assignment and it was called Simon's Assignment for Everybody.
Yes.
After listening to this today, give us one. What would it be?
If you haven't got it, so I go back, a pair of binoculars or a mask and snorkel, get out into the environment. Don't try and understand everything. Don't try and name everything. Just immerse yourself in the wonder of it. Think about, if you're going to think about anything, think about what something's doing and just the mystery of it. Don't even be inclined to necessarily go home and research it. Just let it take you to places in your mind that you haven't thought about before. Try and do that instead of watching the news, and then come back in 2 to 4 weeks' time and tell me that you don't feel better and that you're not more positive about the future, and then that will give you the springboard into working out what you're going to do next.
I love it. That is an assignment that everyone has been issued. I cannot wait to hear what they choose. We are definitely going to be talking about what we chose in our membership.
Send them in, and then
yes,
we'll talk
I
about
will.
it.
Yeah, definitely.
That'd be lovely.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think your book's amazing. It actually wakes us up to the many magical stories that we need to create a bit of a fire in the belly, to look around us more and pick those tiny, teeny projects that as a collective really do make a difference. So thank you for restoring a little eco-hope today.
Quite all right. Thanks, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us in listening to this week's show. If you're not already subscribed or following the show on whatever platform you listened, please do that now. It helps enormously in terms of getting this show out to more people. Another way you can connect and support the work we do so that we can support you in your low tox life is join us in the Low Tox Club. You'll get access to amazing member masterclasses where we invite some of our best show guests for a live Q&A with members. You also have great shopping discounts from low tox businesses and honestly, the nicest low tox community Facebook group that exists on the internet. I do hope you join us there. It costs just the price of a coffee a month on average. Head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the Explore tab, and Low Tox Club is the first option there. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.